Okay, Boker Tov. We left off 2 weeks ago, as they say, if you leave me one day, God says, I leave you for two. So when you miss a week, and I try always so hard not to miss a week as much as possible, it becomes a little more challenging to get back into it, but I think we can do it. We were in the middle of chapter 8, a critical chapter in the book of Shoftim. It's the chapter that the Jewish people asked for a king. It happens to correspond to this week's parashat Shoftim, which talks about the mitzvah of appointing a king and requesting a king. We discussed that at length in our last class. We looked at a whole array of opinions. Is it mandatory? Is it optional? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Basically coming to the conclusion, and we could talk multiple classes just about that a king could be a good thing, could be a bad thing, right? If used properly, we find David and Shlomo usher in golden ages of Jewish connection to God and empires and amazing things, building the Beit HaMikdash, and it's something that we actually look forward to the future. We talk about Melech HaMashiach, the king of salvation that's going to come from David, and so on. As we will also see, the king can also be a rough situation as well. If the king does not follow in the ways of God, he can usher in a period of darkness, a period of hedonism, a period of straying away from the path of Hashem. So a king could be a positive thing, could be a negative thing. It's clear Shemuel takes their request as for a king in the negative. God tries to calm him down and say, it's not you they're rejecting, it's me they're rejecting, which only adds more fuel to the fire that God is not happy about what's taking place over here. But at the same time, God acquiesced to their request. He says, okay, let's start at Pasuk 9. We'll start at verse 9. The Pasuk says, Ve'ata shema bekolam. Despite the adverse reaction of God and Shemuel to the request of the Jewish people, they are asking for something which by laws of the Torah is acceptable. And so therefore God says, Shema bekolam, listen to them. However, we're going to try and fashion this in a way that I, God, and you, Shemuel, are comfortable with. So this was not our ideal approach at this time. As we noted, timing is everything. But nevertheless, we're going to heed their request, but it's going to be under our terms, not under their terms. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we read the Pesukim. Ki ha'ed ta'id bam. God says, I want you to warn them and testify upon them. V'higadtan lahem, and I want you to give over to them mishpat hamelech, the laws of the king, asher yimloch alehim, who will rule over them. Now, it's not 100% clear what he means. What does God mean when he says, tell them the mishpat hamelech? It will seem that it's the laws that Shemuel's about to tell them, which does not paint a very rosy picture of having a king, okay? An alternative explanation is that God wants Shemuel to tell them the laws of the king that we read about in this week's parasha in the Chumash, namely that the king is not allowed to have too many wives, the king is not allowed to have too much gold and silver, the king is not allowed to enlarge his army beyond a certain point and get more horses and bring the people back to Egypt, and the king has to carry a Sefer Torah with him at all times to make sure that he's adhering to the laws of the Torah and remembers the fact that his responsibility is to serve God and to have the people serve God. So it could be that that's what God wants Shemuel to tell the Jewish people about those laws. However, the language of ha'ed ta'id bahem, testify upon them or warn them, doesn't seem to really fit with those laws, because that's not a warning to the Jewish people, that's more of a warning to the king. So it's most likely what Shemuel is about to tell them. Shemuel is about to paint a picture of the king in perhaps a last-ditch effort to convince the Jewish people out of their request for a king. So we're in chapter 8, verse 10, Perek Chet, Pasuk Yud. Let's read Shemuel's monologue over here about the king and see what he's trying to do. We'll read all of the Pesukim, and then we'll take a look at some of our outside sources on this page over here that I gave out, just to see maybe some of the things Shemuel is driving at. Pasuk Yud. Vayomer Shemuel et kol divrei Adonai el ha'am ha'sho'alim me'ito melech. Shemuel said all of the words of God to the people who requested from him a king. Vayomer, and he said to them. Now, already you could see there's like a double vayomer over here. So it sounds like maybe something was said in the interim there that the text didn't tell us what he said. Maybe it's those other laws in the Torah about the king. And now Shemuel goes and gives them more. Vayomer, he says to them, These are the laws of the king, asher yimloch alechem, who will rule upon you. Et benechem yikach, he will take your sons, v'sam lo b'mirkavto u'b'farashav, and he will place them among his chariots and horse riders. In other words, he'll enlist them in the army or in the motorcade or the caravan of the king. And they will run in front of the chariot of the king. This was a very common ancient practice. The king would appoint people to run in front of the king's chariot as a sign of honor and respect that the king is coming. If you think to the movie Aladdin, right, when he does the big thing about Prince Ali is coming and they have all the things coming in front of them, okay? So, all right, I just tipped my hand of, myself a little bit, all right? So the kids like Disney movies. So you have people walking in front of the king, right, as a sign of honor for him. In verse 12, he says that the king will place them as ministers of thousands or ministers of 50s. And he'll appoint for them to plow his field, and to harvest and reap his crops, and to forcibly create his weaponry, and the chariots that they're going to use. So that's what he'll do with your sons. Verse 13, he will also take your daughters, to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He'll also take your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves. He's going to take those away from you as well. And he'll give those to his servants. Verse 15, your grain and your vintage, he's going to tithe them and take 10%. He'll give them to his officers and ministers. Verse 16, and your servants and maidservants, and your choicest of your young men, and your donkeys, he'll take those too. And he will use them for any of his own labors, whatever he needs. Verse 17, he's going to take 1/10 of all your flock, and you will be for him servants. Verse 18, what will all of this bring about? A feeling of oppression, abuse, and corruption that you'll feel. As a result, verse 18, you will scream out and call out in pain on that day, from in front of your king, that you chose for yourself, irony of all ironies. But God will not answer you on that day in which you call out, because guess what? You put yourself in this position by asking for the king. So what is Shemuel's, it's pretty obvious what his goal is over here. What is he trying to paint in this picture over here? He's clearly trying to dissuade the Jewish people and getting them to reconsider their request for a king. He's basically telling them, the king can do what he wants. You guys have this rosy picture of what a king is. You're looking kechol hagoyim asher sevivotai, like all of the Gentiles that are around. Are you really certain that that's what you want? Because this is the mishpat hamelech. The king has the right to confiscate anything and everything that he wants from you and to use it for his own needs and for his own benefit as he sees fit. He's going to take this and he's going to take that and he's going to use this and he's going to abuse that. And you'll call out and cry out in pain on that day and nobody will be there to answer you. Is that what you really want? Right? This is the picture that Shemuel is painting of the king. Questions, thoughts? So first, let's read the Jewish people's response, and then we'll start to analyze this a little bit, because you kind of have to pause and ask yourself, well, wait a minute. Is that really true? Is the picture that Shemuel's painting a legitimate picture? Is the king really allowed to do any of that stuff? Or is Shemuel threatening them with empty threats that really are false? Right. So he's saying it's out of your control. In other words, what is Shemuel telling them? This could possibly happen, right? Right. So to fine tune what you're saying is, Shemuel is not saying that any of this is legal. That's the question that I'm asking, right? Is Shemuel telling them this is the Mishpat HaMelech that the king is actually allowed to do by the laws of the Torah? Mm-hmm. So this brings up a very important question, because when you read the Pisukim in the Torah, it sounds like the Torah wants to constrain the king significantly, right? As we noted before, the pasuk says he shouldn't have too much wealth, and he's not allowed to have too many wives, and so the Torah is nervous about placing a king, rightfully so, and as a result, the Torah creates a framework in which the king is not allowed or will not be able to abuse his constituents and take advantage of his power.
These things aren't specified.
Correct, they're not.
The service of the country.
Right. Okay, so Amy wants to argue. You want to argue that that this could be a legal reality, that the king, if he so feels that it's necessary for the growth of the kingdom and for what he needs, he has access and the right to take these things against the will of the people if he has a reason for it, because the Torah never mentions specifically that any of these things are prohibited to him. Liz, you want to disagree? This is good because we're going to read this exact debate. Yes. An excellent point that Liz brings up. We will see, and I wasn't even prepared to even mention this, but we'll see later a story in the book of Melachim where there's a king by the name of Ahav, who's a wicked king. He is ushered in a point of Avodah Zarah. The prophet at the time is Eliyahu HaNavi, and Ahav has an even more wicked wife by the name of Jezebel. And Ahav wants to expand his palace, and he wants to confiscate a piece of land known as Kerem Navot, the vineyard of a man by the name of Navot. His name is Navot HaKarmeli. And Ahav goes to him and asks permission to buy out Navot, and Navot refuses to sell the land to the king because he says, this is my ancestral piece of land. I refuse to leave and give it up. Now, already you should be asking yourself the question, well, wait a minute. If what Shemuel said is true, that the king can confiscate a vineyard or a piece of land whenever he so chooses, why is he even asking Navot to potentially buy it? He should just go and say, this is my right. I'm allowed to do it. I'm taking it from you and I'll see you later. Obviously, the king does not have full autonomy to do whatever he wants, right? There's obviously, even if we were to assume either Shemuel is saying it legally or maybe not legally, so
the dynamic is going to change.
Right, the dynamic will change. The question is it a legal change, or is Shemuel simply saying, by the way, whether you like it or not, whether the Torah is giving you all these laws, guess what? I'm telling you firsthand, there's going to be kings that are going to come about that are not going to follow these laws. They're going to do whatever they want. So the minute you put in a king, you leave yourself susceptible to the possibility that a king extends his reach and becomes powerful, and there won't be anybody to help you at that time because you put the king in place. Right. Right. It seems like the taxes and the things. Right. The irony of that story is that that's what causes the people to rebel and the kingdom to split into two. Right. So this is the dark side of the king, which is things that are in his power to be able to do, because ultimately he does have that power, whether it's legal or not, and it could even be legal for him to do it, are going to cause difficulty for the people during those times. In a minute, we'll take a look at the actual debate inside the Gemara. But it's clear whatever Shemuel's motivation is, he's trying to get the people to reconsider. Do the people reconsider? No, they don't reconsider. Verse 19, the people refused to listen to the voice of Shemuel, to heed his words. They say to him, no. So clearly they understood what Shemuel was trying to do, and they rebuff him. We want the king. We're steadfast in our demands. We want the king. Verse 20, they reiterate again, and we shall be like all of the other nations. And our king will judge us, and he will go out in front of us, and he will fight our battles. Verse 21, Shemuel hears the words of the people, And he brings the message back to God. And you can say, why does God need to have the message brought back to him? I'm sure God heard what was going on. But this is classic prophet, people, God interactions. Moshe does this a lot as well when the Jews are ready to receive the Torah. He brings the word of the people back to God as well. He's the communicator between the two of them. What is God's reaction in the final verse of chapter 8? Vayomer Adonai el Shemuel shema bekolam. God says to Shemuel, listen to them. Vehimlachta lahem melech. And appoint for them a king. Vayomer Shemuel el Anshe Yisrael. Shemuel says to the Jewish people, Lechu ish le'iro. Each person go home with this. The search for the king is going to start, but the search for the king and the appointment of the king is not going to be placed in the hands of the people. It's going to be placed in the hands of God and Shemuel. They're going to be the ones to control who's going to be the king. So despite God stepping over the line and reaching out his hand metaphorically to the Jewish people to accept their request, God says, but it's going to be under my terms. This is the Mishpat HaMelech, and I'm going to be the one to determine who's fit to be the first king. And that's going to be the next chapters that we're going to go into. Chapter 9 is going to be choosing Shaul and what made Shaul worthy and how we get to Shaul to be the king. And the process of getting Shaul to be king is going to take a few chapters, 9, 10, 11, 12. We won't actually see Shaul be accepted as the king till the end of the next 4 chapters. So this is going to be a bit of a lengthy process. Okay. Any questions or comments or thoughts just to the end of chapter 8? So, yeah. Right. So at least they're willing to accept that authority. Yeah. That is maybe something to the credit as opposed to maybe appointing their own king. So they do go through the channels, at least the channels that the Torah is willing to do. Yeah, they're going to the Navi. So that is at least some positive, and maybe that's why God accepts their request, right, and is willing to go through with it. A couple of things that I want to point out here using some of our sources. Let's start first on the first source of the page that I gave you over here, and I'm projecting it on the screen, is a Gemara in Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf Kaf Amud Bet. Yeah, we have it. Here we actually find that the debate that Amy and Liz just engaged in is actually a debate amongst the rabbis of the Gemara. We'll read the Gemara together. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shemuel. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shemuel, Kol ha'amur beparashat melech, melech mutarbo. Whatever is mentioned in the parasha of the king, here in the Navi, the king is allowed to it. So here's a fascinating thing. It's just worth pointing out. We have ambiguity in the Torah regarding some of these powers that the king has. And we're actually using the Navi and this story in the Navi to determine what is going to be in those instances, right? We're using the Navi to shed light onto the Torah. So while the Navi is not a book which can create new laws, right? At least not ones that are on the level of the Torah. We have a concept in halakha, en navi rashai lechadesh davar me'ata. A navi, a prophet, is not allowed to create a new law that he places on the same level as the laws of the Torah. Once the Torah was written and closed by Moshe Rabbeinu, no other law post that can reach the same level as the laws of Moshe. Any navi, any prophet who claims such a thing is immediately termed a false prophet and is put to death. You cannot add anything to the laws of the Torah on that same thing. We can do what we call rabbinic laws, right? We can institute like a new holiday like Hanukkah or Purim, and we could put in certain fences and decrees, but all of those have the status of derabanan. They're all rabbinic laws, or some rabbis call it divrei Kabbalah. They're receiving laws, traditional laws, but they all occupy a status slightly underneath the laws that come from the Torah that are in the 613 mitzvot of the Torah. So, but we can use the Navi sometimes to shed light on something that is unclear in the Torah itself, like we did last week when we talked about is the mitzvah of appointing a king mandatory or optional. We can use the stories that we have in the Navi to shed light on whether what is the case over there, or as we're doing now, what are the real powers of the king, which were not delineated in the Torah. So Shemuel wants to say anything that's mentioned in this chapter is in fact illegal according to law for the king to take. And that's why Shemuel is telling it to them. Rav Amar, however, his colleague Rav disagreed and said, lo ne'emra parasha zo ela le'ayem alayhim. This chapter was not written, but as a threat to the people. In other words, Rav is saying that when Shemuel gave them this speech about what the king can do, he was actually talking not about what the king has the legal right to do. The king is actually not legally allowed to do this. Shemuel was telling them, despite the fact that it's not legal, this is what you could expect when you have a king. Know that when you put someone in a position of absolute power, the way you are planning to do with the king, this is the cause, this is what will happen, inevitably. So he's threatening them essentially. Shene'emar, as the pasuk says, Som tasim alecha melech, shetehe emato alecha. The king's fear should be upon you. In other words, the king has the right to do some of these things if he feels that he needs to reel the people in order to impose fear upon them. This is what he's going to do. So despite not being legal, this is what the king will end up doing in order to impose his will, as it were, upon the people. So this very debate that Amy and Liz engaged in about the Psukim is front and center when it comes to the Gemara Masechet Sanhedrin. How do the rabbis rule? How do they rule in terms of Psak Halacha? Huh? I don't think so. No. Actually, they rule like Shemuel, if I'm not mistaken. I could pull up here just for a minute the Rambam in his Laws of Kings. Let's just find it.
Sorry, Rabbi, when someone in the class says something, can you repeat their question? It's hard to hear.
Yes, I will repeat the question. What did you miss? Tell me if
Just the last thing that Liz said.
Liz wanted to say that the halacha was that the king is not allowed to take these things, and I said that I believe the halacha, as I will illustrate in a moment now, is that the king is allowed to take what he desires. It's the very end of the Rambam's laws of kings and wars. I want to say it's like chapter. Let's see. Actually, I should just have clicked on my Safari thing. What am I doing here? I'm like forgetting how we do Safari. It should pull it up for me in a minute. Zeye Mishpat HaMelech. Let's see. Halacha, Rambam, Laws of Kings, Kings and Wars. It is chapter 4. That was one off. Okay, chapter 4. Rambam, Laws of Kings and Wars. What does it say? Okay, chapter 4. I'll read to you a few laws here. Reshut yesh lamelech liten mas al ha'am litzrachav. Permission is granted to the king to impose a tax upon the people as he sees fit. Or letzorech milchamot, if it's for the needs of the king or if it's for the needs of the war effort. Vekotzev lo meches, the king establishes what that amount is going to be. Ve'asur lehavriach min hameches, nobody is allowed to flee from paying that tax. Sheyesh lo ligzor shekol mi sheyignov hameches yilakach mamono o yehareg. The king is allowed to make a decree that anybody who should steal the taxes, who cheats on his taxes to pay, his money can be confiscated against his will, or he could be put to death for rebelling against the king. As the pasuk says, "Va'atem tiyu lo avadim." They quote the pasuk in Shemuel, "You will be servants to the king." Ulehalan hu omer, the pasuk says, "Yu lecha lamas va'avaducha." What does it mean to be a servant of the king? To be a servant of the king is to pay taxes. What we call she'ibud in the language of the Tanakh is to be required to pay taxes. Mikan shenoten mas v'kotzev meches. From here we see that the king could do as he wishes to impose a tax. And his words are, shekol ha'amur beparashat melech, whatever is mentioned in the chapter of the king, the chapter we just read, melech zochebo. The king earns that right and merits in it. So the Rambam clearly rules like Shemuel that you're allowed to take he could take whatever he wants. He does need, however, a tzorech, right? He can't do it just for his own aggrandizement. That's where the Torah comes in and says you have to temper your own power for your own glorification or your own ego. But if the melech feels that it is necessary, he has the right to make institutions for his needs, the government's needs, or the war effort's needs. And whether the people agree with him or not, he has the right to do that. Right. Right. So Sarah's asking that she feels like you can sort of justify any type of taking if the king could come up with a reason for it. The answer is maybe. Yeah, the answer is maybe. Huh? No, Achav does not end up taking his land. Because it seems, why didn't he take that land? It seems as though it's obvious to everybody, had he taken that land, he was not going to do anything. It was just a vineyard. It was not going to produce anything that was necessary for the greater good of the people or the kingdom, right? It was really more of a personal conflict that he had. And it was obvious to everybody that it was a personal conflict that he had, which is why he doesn't confiscate it. He ends up getting it, by the way, but he gets it in a dirty way. His wife spreads a rumor about Navot that he's Chayav Mita, and they put him to death because his wife bribes false witnesses, the wife bribes the judges, and he ends up being put to death, and you can take the land, right? But he suffers a whole lot shadier, exactly, a whole lot shadier. But it needed to be a whole lot shadier because he doesn't have the right to go ahead and take that. That's obviously for his own personal need. Yeah, as when we get to the stories of Achav, we'll certainly see the things that Achav does over here. Yeah. Right, so the Beit HaMikdash, his own palace. So Liz brings up the idea that he first taxed the people for the Beit HaMikdash, which is clearly a tax that the people were willing to accept, but he further taxes them to build his own property. But he'll make that claim, as Sarah pointed out, that the king needs to have the palace and has to have the glory of the king. And he's rolling all these empires. Shlomo built a massive empire. He made treaties with everybody. But to a certain extent, you're right. He used all of those. Shlomo used his rationale to violate the specific laws of the Torah itself, right? He has 1,000 wives and he imports gold from all over the place, right? So, I mean, Shemuel is telling us this is the nature of the king, is that yes, the king can justify anything. And who's going to call him out at that point? Who's going to tell him, no, you're doing this for yourself? He'll find a way to justify it, rationalize it, to the extent that Shlomo rationalized the commandments that were explicitly written into the Torah. And as a result, the people suffered. And that's what he's saying. Once you give a person that power and you give them gray areas, they're bound to take advantage of it. And the Rambam continues over here that he could go ahead and recruit people for his army and put them in front. He says he could recruit people to be his craftsmen, enlist artisans. Essentially, the Rambam expands upon everything in this chapter because he takes the approach of Shemuel that in fact all of these things are mutar, are permissible for the king to take if he has an explanation as to why he's taking it for the needs of the kingdom or the needs of the government or so on and so forth. Yes. Yes, what Shemuel is correct. What Shemuel is saying over here is, at least by the opinion of Shemuel in the Gemara, is that yes, the king has these legal things, and do you really want him to have that legal power? Because there is a very fine line between how the king uses those things properly versus how he extends himself beyond the line and starts to be corrupt and oppressive, and nobody will be able to keep him in check in that line once he crosses it, right? That's basically what he's saying. Who keeps the Navi in check is Sarah's question. Him. No, but he can't, right? So the difference is that the Navi is the one who is bringing the message of God. He's communicating directly with God. The king is not communicating directly with God. In fact, there's a big debate, we'll talk about it when we get to David. Was David HaMelech talking with God? David writes the book of Tehillim, which is divinely inspired, but we don't find anywhere that David has a communication with God. Shlomo has communications with God in a dream state. There's an element of nivu'ah there. But there always seems to be a Navi that is in charge of checking the power of the king. The king has the right to do what he wants, but the Navi will be the one to tell him when he's extending himself too far. David has Natan HaNavi who tells him, Shlomo has Achia HaShiloni who tells him, and Achav has Eliyahu, and then they have Elisha. In fact, if you think about it, Judaism is the first to really express this idea of a balance of powers, right? Even though there's a monarchy, there's clearly a balance of powers. There is a king, but the king is not a Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol is in charge of what goes on as far as the priestly service is concerned in the temple. And then you have the Navi, you have the prophet. So you almost have three different branches of rulership, of leadership for the Jewish people. The Kohen Gadol is sort of the service leader. You have the king, who's the political leader, and you have the Navi, who's the spiritual leader. And each one is in charge of keeping the other in a certain path. The Navi being perhaps the most critical of all of them. No question.
Rabbi,
yes.
do we actually have all three of those leaders at the same exact time? Or
Sure.
really did the Navihood, I didn't say that right, but fade out a little bit? So you have the Kohen Gadol and you have the thing. Do we have all three at the same time?
We have all three of them throughout the book of Kings. Throughout the
But-
book of Kings, we'll have it. From the
But
moment
not
the
all at the same time.
all at the same time. Yes,
Oh.
each generation will have all three of them at the same time. So you'll have, once we start getting into David HaMelech, we'll start to note who's the king. David will be the king. Then you'll have a bit of a power struggle for the Kohen Gadol, which is appointed by the king, Evyatar HaKohen, or Benayahu ben Yehoyada HaKohen, and you'll have the Navi, who's Natan Navi. And in each generation, we will have a three-headed monster, as it were, of king, priest, and prophet. All three, balancing each other out, right? The prophet is probably the most critical of all of them. And that's why Shemuel is bugging out over here, to use a type of term, right? He's upset because it sounds like, are they trying to marginalize Shemuel's power? Are they going to put a king in and push Shemuel to the side? Shemuel is going to need to hold on to a significant amount of his power to keep Shaul in check, to keep David in check. He's going to need to do that. And when he dies, he's going to have to transfer the reign. So Shemuel has to hold that post in order to keep the Navi involved, because the Navi is critical and to checking the power of the king. Yeah.
In Devarim 15, when Hashem tells us that he's going to have a it almost seems like it's a concession. We were talking about this yesterday. It's a concession to the people because the culture of the time was they adored these diviners and these people, and Hashem is saying, go to the land, do not go to the goyim and diviners. I'm going to give you a Navi.
Right.
But it doesn't never indicate that the Navi is supposed to be this, moral leader that's, combat the king. It just becomes that way.
Right. So Amy's question is, when the Torah presents the idea of a Navi, it presents it more as a way to avoid getting involved in the dark powers of the world, right? We as human beings are curious by nature. We want to know what's going to happen. We want to feel like we have communication with God. And if we see these dark alleyways where we can get those types of communications, we're going to start to engage in a lot of very shady stuff. And so the Torah tells us, no, Navi akim lahem bekerev ha'im kamocha. I'm going to establish a prophet for you, and the prophet's going to be where you're going to go. Almost like saying, don't go there, go to the prophet. But the prophet is sort of a response to the dangerous areas where a person could go ahead. And you're saying, so that sort of portrays the Navi as not being an idealistic leader, but almost more of a response to the problems that could arise. Very similar to what we say about the king, right? The king is not an idealistic leader, but if you're going to need to have somebody who leads like the rest of the goyim, and this is what you have to do, like some opinions wanted to say, then place a king in terms of it, which I hear that approach, and there's a lesson to be learned there. Ideally speaking, we shouldn't need any of these people. We should be able to directly have a relationship with God. But as we know, we needed Moshe Rabbeinu, and we needed people who are going to be those intermediaries between us and God. It seems as though the Navi is the best option of all of those, because it's too challenging for a nation of human beings to be able to foster on such a grand level an intimate connection with God without having somebody in between, right? So I think that's ultimately where the Navi stands and why he's such a critical figure. Yes, the Torah portrays it as the opposite of those other things, but I think in that chapter, the Torah wants to illustrate more the evils of the dark magic and is telling you, that's why I gave you a Navi, at least one of his roles. But then we know the Navi's roles are multifaceted. Take a look at the next source that I have on your sheet, just the textual connection here. Notice Shemuel uses a few what we call recurring phrases, key words. In Hebrew, the modern day scholars talk about this as a milat mancha, right? A recurring word. So all throughout Shemuel's monologue, what is he using? He's using a lot of chem, A lot of the suffix chem. A lot of the suffix chem means your. Benotechem, your daughters. Benechem, your sons. Sadotechem, your fields. Karmechem, your vineyards. Zetechem, your olive groves. Avdechem, Amhotechem, Shifhotechem. A lot of chem. In other words, he's trying to drive home the point. The king has access to all of your stuff. The things that you think are yours, that you have control over, they at any point in time can be confiscated by the king if he so desires and comes up with a reason to do so. Guess what another recurring idea is? Yikah. He's going to take. Benotechem yikah. 4 times in Shemuel's monologue, he uses the term yikah. The king will take from you. He's trying to illustrate yours, he will take. Yours, he will take. Yours, he will take. That's what Shemuel is emphasizing over here. In a beautiful way, we're going to fast forward 4 chapters for a minute to chapter 12, Yud Bet. Look at the second source on your page. This is Shemuel's final words to the Jewish people. Look at how ironic his words are. He says, Hineni anubi neged Hashem v'neged Meshicho. Here I am, says Shemuel, in my final speech to you, I testify against me in the presence of God and in the presence of the Anointed One. Et shor mi lakachti. Whose ox have I taken? V'hamor mi lakachti. Whose donkey have I taken? Ve'et mi ashakti. Who have I oppressed or defrauded? Et mi ratzoti. Who have I robbed? Umiyad mi lakachti kofet. From whom have I taken a bribe? Ve'alim enai bo. And I ignored himself. Ve'ashiv lachem. Tell me now, and I'll return it to you. This is a rhetorical question, obviously, on the part of Shemuel, but he's literally challenged the people. He's saying, someone come to me and tell me what I've done wrong, and I will fix it now so that I clean my slate before I move on. Because Shemuel's ready to die and transfer the reins over to Shaul, the king. Notice how he uses it. And then the next passage says, Vayomeru, they respond to him, Lo ashaktano, you never oppressed us. Velo ratzotano, you did not take bribes from us or rob us. Velo lakahta miyad ish me'uma, you did not take a single thing from anybody. 4 times in this little speech, the idea of lakahat, to take, was again mentioned, paralleling the 4 times that Shemuel said it when he warned them about what the king would do. Shemuel is driving the point home, even at his last time, speaking to the Jewish people. Understand what you did. You replaced me, Shemuel, someone who didn't take a single thing from any of you, and you replaced him with a guy who could take whatever he wants. And guess what? He will take whatever he wants, as we see happen time and again in the book of Kings. So understand and remember what you chose is Shemuel's harsh message to the Jewish people in his final words. You chose somebody who will take against your will, and you gave up someone like me who didn't take a single penny from any of you, who treated you all the way you wanted to be treated. It's a harsh criticism, and again, illustrates what Shemuel was bothered by so much when they asked for a king, rejecting him and taking a king who's going to do all of these things to the Jewish people. It's pretty fascinating, yeah.
Better choices who aren't going to do these things. So it seems like
so Liz is asking, he's saying that the question is, it's strange because if God wants to, he could have decided to appoint someone better.
Like Shaul.
Right. But the yeah, everyone has free will, right? Well, in defense of the Jewish people, you're right? The person who could have been in defense. Who was Shemuel prepared to put in? His own sons, who we found out were not exactly on the level, right, as Shemuel was. So it's not, to their defense, is the Navi a perfect system all the time as well? Do Shemuel transitioning the reins to somebody else? You have to have someone who's worthy of going ahead and being it, right? And so to defend the Jewish people a little bit, they didn't really see where this was going. They didn't really see the light at the end of the tunnel and decided to pivot away, right? Shemuel is not happy about it, but there's definitely a tug of war going on over here. But the key for Shemuel is the system that we currently have allows for someone like me. The system that you want to adopt does not. And that's the issue that you're going to have now moving forward. You're putting someone in who is more powerful than me as a leader from that perspective. And now you're going to have to suffer those consequences with their free decisions, right? To continue a little bit in the sheet over here, the other thing that the Navi does that the king is unable to do is to defend the people. And this also is hinted in Shemuel's words. Look at Shemuel's words. This is in chapter 7, which we read before this chapter. Remember when Shemuel led this awakening of religiosity for the Jewish people to defeat the Philistine, yes? The pasuk says, "Vayikach Shemuel telech chalav echad." Shemuel took a young suckling goat, lamb, vaya'alehu olah kalil laHashem, and he brought it up as an offering on behalf of the Jewish people to God. Vayiza'ak Shemuel el Adonai. Shemuel calls out to God, screams out to God on behalf of the Jewish people, Be'ad Yisrael. Vaya'anehu Hashem. And God answers Shemuel. Shemuel is the defender of the Jewish people. Vahi Shemuel ma'aleh ha'olah u'Pelishtim nigeshu le'milchama b'Yisrael. And then the Philistine come and attack the Jewish people. Vayara'em Adonai be'kol gadol bayom ha'hu. On that day, the day that Shemuel prayed on behalf of the Jewish people, God makes a loud noise and defends the Jewish people and it brings them salvation. Because of whom? Because of the Navi, because of Shemuel. Notice the words, Vayiza'ak, he cried out on their behalf. Vaya'anehu Hashem, God answered him. Bayom hahu, on that day. The Navi, one of his purposes is he stands as a wall between God and the Jewish people to defend their honor and to give them zechut. Now look at what Shemuel says about the king. Look what he says about the king. Go to verse 18. Look at the same words. Guess what, says Shemuel? Uza'aktem bayom hahu. Ze'aka. You'll scream out to God. On that day, bayom hahu, on the day that you need salvation and you need help, and guess what? Velo ya'ane Adonai etchem. God will not answer you on that day. So unlike what Shemuel is hinting to the Jewish people, unlike what I did for you, I was able to cry out to God on a specific day, and God answered me. And that's why you were saved. The king won't be able to do that. In fact, the king will be the source of your crying out to God. And there'll be no one to listen to you on that day. Because guess what? You marginalized me, the Navi, and his power to be able to defend you on your behalf to God. And now you don't have that. This is a critical turning point for the Jewish people, right? Shemuel is giving them the business, to use another non-technical term, right? And he's going hard at the Jewish people. And despite all of that, they don't change their mind. By ma'anu, they refuse. They accept the fact that they want to have a king nevertheless, and the fate that comes with having that. So it's a harsh reality when we look at what takes place in this chapter. Yeah. There is, Lisa's right, there is always a Navi, but the Navi does not occupy the same status anymore as he once did. As the sole leader of the Jewish people, the Navi was in charge of everything. And as a result, everything was sort of packaged into this spiritual person who could lead them in all different directions spiritually. Now that we are going to compartmentalize, we're basically going to strip the Navi of certain positions and posts that he holds, and we're going to put him into a specific area and a specific task, giving the Melech now many of his responsibilities, and the Melech will ultimately be the person whom the people look to for guidance and to do in wars and in politics and in how the national economy is going to run and what we're going to do. The king is going to be the one who drives it, right? Yes, of course, with the assistance of the Navi, but the Navi is much more marginalized. He doesn't occupy that same status. And so we really don't find any more from this time of Shemuel moving forward. We don't find Nevi'im who supported the Jewish people. Quite to the contrary. What is Eliyahu HaNavi's biggest fault that we will read about? He argues against the people. He says to God, God, why do you want these people? They left your covenant. They've all abandoned you. And God has to be the one to say to Eliyahu, tone it down, Eliyahu, right? The Navi is actually antagonistic towards the people because he can't stand the way that they're doing. He's not the leader anymore. Achav is the leader. So the Navi is sometimes feeling incredibly frustrated and powerless against the direction which the king ushers in. And that will be the new reality. Eliyahu will feel powerless against the king. Elisha will feel powerless against the king. Yirmiyahu will feel the most powerless against the king. Yirmiyahu is screaming to high heaven, the Beit HaMikdash is going to be destroyed, the Beit HaMikdash is going to be destroyed. And the king says, man, we don't listen to this kook. Leave him on the side. And everyone pays attention to the king. What are you going to do? You're going to listen to the king. The king is the leader. He's the one who occupies the power now. And that's what's so devastating to Shemuel in this turn of change in the history of the Jewish people. Really, everything changes course because of this chapter, what goes on in these few parakim.
I feel like the shofet, the difference between the shofet and the melech is that the shofet.
So yeah, Liz is comparing it to the shoftim errors. We found a lot more in the shoftim of calling out against enemies and things like that. The shofet was often a response to the calling out. There was a vacuum of the calling out. Right. It's hard for us because, right. At the same time, it's hard for us because the book of Shoftim constantly told us how bad the situation is. And Melech B'Yisrael, there's no king, and Melech B'Yisrael. So looking at it from that perspective, it sounds like, okay, this should be a good thing. But again, the way in which it was ushered in, the goals that the Jewish people had in mind for this king did not fit what Shemuel himself in the book of Shoftim was trying to illustrate they needed as a result. So they replaced one evil in Shemuel's mind with another. Now, there is still hope because if they can put it together, that's the whole idea of Shaul and David and Shlomo. If we could put the pieces together, we could experience a lot of great things if we can put it together. But Shemuel has a certain nervousness about that situation if we can, and he's proven to be correct. Yeah. Right. Yeah. 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 Right. So Amy's pointing out the fact that the Kichol HaGoyim is more about, we want him to lead us in this fast and we want them to make the decisions for us. They don't ever express that the king should be a spiritual guide for them. They don't ever look at him as somebody who could be a model for the divine, as a shaliach of Hashem. That's something that God puts on. And that's why God constantly refers to David as my shaliach, my messenger, and Shlomo as my messengers, because ultimately that's the best frame that you could make for the king, as the king being an emissary of God. And that's ultimately what he needs to be. He needs to be the leader who represents God, and he has to serve the people, not serve himself. Rabbi Sachs has a beautiful essay on this week's parasha about how the ultimate leader is one who's a servant to the people, not the other way around. So Shemuel is painting the picture of Atem tiyu lo avadim. What will inevitably happen is you will be serving the king, because the king in the position of power is not going to accept the role of it's his job to serve the people, which is ultimately the greatest leadership. That's why our greatest leader was Moshe Rabbeinu, and our prophets are typically our greatest leaders because they serve the people. Huh? You like Yehoshua? Yeah, nothing bad happens in Yehoshua. So a vote for Yehoshua by Liz. Also, you like the underdog. You like the guy who nobody thinks about. You know what I mean? Like Hazit Yehoshua. But we've often said Yehoshua is an extension of Moshe. They kind of go. Yeah. I'd like to make one last point on sort of piggybacking off of what Amy was saying about the goals of the people. One very subtle textual difference, but I think makes all the difference in the world. And then we'll end with the gloom and doom of the king before we get into at least some of the positive elements, which is Shaul. Notice when the Jewish people ask for the king the first time. Let's go back to that for a minute. Take a look at Pasuk 6, Pasuk Vav. There's a very, very, very subtle back and forth that goes about between Shemuel and the Jewish people. It's almost very hard to miss, very easy to miss it, but Rabbi Amnon Bazak makes a great point about it. Notice when the Jewish people ask God, they say, actually not in Pasuk 6, go to first to Pasuk 5. The Pasuk says, Ata sima lanu melech. What do the words sima lanu melech mean? Put for us a king. Okay. Why did you say for us? Which word were you translating there, Liz? For us? Lanu. Lanu, put for us. Okay. Next pasuk, Shemuel is very bothered by this. Vayera hadavar, kasher amru, that they said, Tena lanu melech l'shoftenu. Give for us a king to judge us. They use the word lanu again. Now take a look at the next pasuk. God says, Ki lo otcham ma'asu, they didn't despise you. Ki oti ma'asu, they despised me. Mimeloch alehem, from ruling alehem. What does alehem mean?
Them.
Over them. In other words, the Jews are saying, give for us a king, rejecting the model of God ruling over them as a king. Okay? Notice how this is going to continue, right? Now, look at verse 9. God says, listen to them, but make sure to warn them. Give them the laws of the king, asher yimloch alehim, that will rule over them. Notice how we keep, every time God speaks about it, it's always alehim. When the Jews are speaking about it, it's lanu, for us. What do you think that difference is? Small word, but makes a huge difference. Right. Right, so Sarah says that alehim, it means he's more powerful than you. What do you say about lanu? Lanu means... Okay, good. In other words, what were the Jewish people asking for when they wanted a king? We want a king who's going to do what we say. In other words, we're tired of you, the Navi, always telling us what we need to do. So guess what we're going to do? We want to put a king who's going to be lanu, who's going to be for us, who's going to do our best interests, which don't involve any more of this alenu, somebody over us constantly. And God says, I know you're rejecting me ruling over you, but guess what, Shemuel? We're going to listen to them theoretically by putting in the king, but the king is not going to be the way they're thinking about it. Lanu, for us. No. It's going to be alehim. It's going to be on them, and on them in a very different way, not for the positive. And then he continues to go. Verse 11, this is going to be the mishpat hamelech asher yimloch alechem. Shemuel makes sure to mention alechem, right? If you continue to skip down, finally, the Jewish people get the picture, right? They get the picture and they still take it. Look at verse 19. Verse 19. What do the Jewish people say? Vayma'anu ha'am, they refused. Lishmoa bekol Shemuel, to listen to the voice of Shemuel. Vayomeru lo, they say to him, no. Ki im melech yihye alenu. We'll still take it. We'll take the king on us. We're so adamant about having a king to reject God. If it means that the king will be over us instead of God, so be it. Alenu. We'll take that too, right? This is to help us understand why didn't they change their mind, right? They didn't change their mind because ultimately they just want to remove God being Alenu. Good. Excellent. I was waiting for someone to tell me that, right? Yeah, right. Then later on, where is it? In the last pasuk, right? In Chaf Bet. Where is it? No. In Chaf Bet. Vayomer Adonai el Shemuel shema bekolam v'himlachta lahem melech. It's true. God at the end uses that idea of giving lahem. So look what he writes. Rabbi Amnon Bazak. He says, Av sheha'am yodea ata. Even though the nation knows now at this point, ki hamelech yimloch alehem, the king will rule over them. En lehit'alem mikach, do not ignore the fact שבסופו של דבר, at the end of the day, צפוי גם רווח ממינוי מלך, וכי הוא יהיה גם להם. In the end of the day, God is saying, this is what is ideal, but I know what's going to end up happening. The king is going to end up being lahem. Right. True. Yeah. So in the end of the day, God, right. So God is saying in the end of the day, I'm going to try to make it as best as I can for them. I don't want them to fail, is what God is saying. But as the rabbis tell us, in the path that a person wants to walk, God is not going to reject the people. If ultimately their request is a matter of the Torah, it's mentioned there. God already agreed to it in the Torah itself. So God cannot come to them now and say, no, I refuse to give you the king. What do you mean? How could God say no to the king when it's written explicitly in the Torah that he's willing to accept it? Asima alai melech. Alai. That's what the people are requesting. It's not ideal. Exactly. Yes. Exactly. That's where the difference was. In the Torah, it's expressed as Asima alai melech. I'm going to give upon me a king while still recognizing that God is above me. Then the people say, no, I want lanu. So God's not happy with that. He says, no, I'm going to put him alecha. It's going to be on you. But at the end of the day, I know what's going to happen, says God. Eventually, the king is going to turn to be lahem. Is going to be with their best interest in mind, not my best interest in mind. He says, at the end of the day, the request of the king was very convoluted. There's a lot of different things going on, as we've already illustrated. It's an incredibly confusing time because the request is acceptable, but the thoughts of what's going on, the intentions of what's going on, the vision that each party has in this request is very different from what's ideal, from what's supposed to be, versus what is ending up going to happen. He says, the concept of monarchy in and of itself, it is not guaranteed that it's going to be something bad. So in the end of the day, God says, yes, I will give you the one that you want, and maybe it will turn out good, as Sarah pointed out, right? God does not ultimately want this to fail. That's why God's going to take control of the situation and say, I'll give you what you want on my terms so that at least we can compromise and maybe you'll be successful. One of the central aspects of success in the monarchy will be the ability of the king to find, izun is the balance. Anybody know why it's called izun? Just a little ozen. Because ears is where your balance is, right? If you ever get like an ear thing or you get stuffed up, all of a sudden you lose your balance. So in Hebrew, the word balance is izun, from ears. I just thought that was interesting just for a little language. Right? It says, Nimtso et ha'izun, to find the balance, hanachon, sheben melucha al ha'am, of ruling above the people, uben melucha lema'an ha'am, and being for the people. The king has to know how to strike that balance. When do I need to impose myself on the people for the greater good? And when do I need to be for the people for their greater good? For example, you brought up, Liz, before Rehavam with the taxes. That was a moment that Rehavam needed to be lahim. He needed to be for them. He needed to be on their side. He needed to take their position to be softer upon them. Instead, he chose to be alehim. So a decision by a king to rule instead of to be lahim is fatal to his melucha. At the same time, we find many kings who wanted to be popular and so ushered in the avodah zarah that would make them popular to the people, and they were being lahim instead of being alehim. By the way, I think every position of power is like this. As a teacher, right, you have to balance being above the students and also being on the same side as the students. Sometimes you need to be soft and know what their needs are and meet their needs. And sometimes what they want is not acceptable. You need to be authoritative over them. A teacher's ability to know when to be authoritative and when to be democratic is critical to the way they'll have a relationship with their students. If they put in democracy when they need to be authoritative, the children will walk all over them. If they're authoritative when they need to be democratic, the children will hate the class. They won't want to learn anything. They're just going to be like this teacher's doing whatever they want. Parents, the same thing. Sometimes you need to be able to give the children when they're leeway and I'll be for you and on your side and aid. Sometimes I need to be authoritative when I know the decision you're making is critical, is a critical error and could destroy a major aspect of your life. So anybody who's in a position of leadership needs to know this balance between lahim versus alehim, and that's what God is saying in the end of the day. Ultimately the king, I am alehim, God is saying, and I am also lahim. The king needs to strike this balance between alehim and lahim. The people only wanted lahim. They only wanted him on that side. God says, no, we're going to have a balance, and that's what God's going to choose and try to direct the Jewish people towards in the coming chapters with Shaul and David and others as well. Any questions, thoughts? I think we really churned out this chapter in many different ways. Be'ezat Hashem, the next 3 chapters, 9, 10, 11, are the rise of Shaul and how he's chosen to be the leader. A lot of fun stories, a lot of fun stuff. Chapter 12, we end with Shemuel, and then we continue on the legacy of Shaul. Be'ezat Hashem, we move back to 1 perek a day, hopefully in our next class, and we move to the stories of Shaul. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen.